The rain was coming down hard that Tuesday evening when Frank Martinez stepped through the brass doors of the Grand Continental Hotel. His worn leather jacket dripped onto the marble floor. His gray beard, streaked with decades of hard living, framed a face marked by service and sacrifice. The 73-year-old veteran moved slowly, his left leg bearing the invisible weight of shrapnel from a jungle far away and a war most people preferred to forget. He approached the mahogany reception desk with the same quiet dignity he'd carried through life, the same respect he'd shown his country for 2 tours in Vietnam. The young manager behind the counter looked up from his computer screen. His name, tag read, Bradley Chen, Guest Services Manager. His eyes swept over Frank's appearance with the kind of judgment that cuts deeper than any enemy bullet. The wet jacket, the weathered boots, the simple clothes that spoke of a man living on a fixed income, making every dollar stretch like a tactical operation. Can I help you? Bradley's tone carried the chill of a winter morning at boot camp. Frank reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a crumpled reservation confirmation. His hands, once steady enough to save lives under fire, now trembled slightly with age. I have a reservation. Frank Martinez. Room for 3 nights. Bradley's eyes didn't even glance at the paper. Instead, they traveled again over Frank's appearance, lingering on the small holes in his jacket, the scuffed boots, the humble bearing of a man who'd never asked for much from life except the chance to serve his country with honor. I'm sorry, sir, but I don't think this establishment is quite suitable for your needs. The words fell like artillery shells in the quiet lobby. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at one of the budget motels down Highway 34. The silence that followed was deafening. Other guests in the lobby stopped their conversations. A well-dressed couple near the elevator turned to stare. Frank's weathered face showed no anger, just the same composure he'd learned when facing enemy fire. But something flickered in his eyes, the same fire that had carried him through the jungles of Southeast Asia when bullets flew and good men died. I paid in advance, Frank said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd commanded respect in foxholes and base camps. Confirmation number 77942. Bradley didn't even pretend to check his system. Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. We maintain certain standards here, and frankly, you don't meet them. Security can escort you out if necessary. Frank stood there for a moment, rain still dripping from his jacket onto the expensive marble. His purple heart, hidden beneath that worn leather, seemed to burn against his chest. The bronze star, tucked away in his wallet, felt heavier than the pack he'd carried through the Mekong Delta. This wasn't the first time he'd faced an enemy who underestimated him, but it might have been the most humiliating. He turned without another word, his boots echoing in the hollow space of that grand lobby. The sound followed him like the ghost of marching orders, like the memory of formations called at dawn when the world was different and service meant something to everyone, not just to those who'd worn the uniform. What the arrogant manager didn't know was about to change everything. If you believe respect doesn't retire with age, hit that like button, drop a comment saying honor, and subscribe because some battles are worth fighting no matter how old the warrior gets. Frank walked back into that cold rain, but he wasn't walking away defeated. He was walking toward a phone call that would mobilize an army. Because what Bradley Chen had just done wasn't just an insult to one old veteran. It was a declaration of war against every man and woman who'd ever worn the uniform, every soul who'd ever stood between freedom and tyranny, every heart that had ever beaten with the rhythm of patriotic duty. The rain kept falling, but Frank Martinez was already planning his counterattack. And when veterans unite, the ground itself trembles with the force of brotherhood forged in fire. That night, in his small apartment 20 minutes from the Grand Continental, Frank sat at his kitchen table with a cup of black coffee and a phone, book that had seen better decades. His arthritis made dialing difficult, but his resolve made it unstoppable. The first number he called belonged to Tommy Rodriguez, his old squad leader from Charlie Company. Tommy had survived Quezon and built a successful construction business in Phoenix. The second call went to Marcus Williams, the medic who'd saved Frank's life twice in the same week back in '68. Marcus had become a doctor, retired now, but still sharp as the day he'd stitched wounds under mortar fire. Each conversation started the same way. "Tommy, it's Frank Martinez from Charlie Company. I need to tell you what happened today." And each conversation ended with the same promise. "We'll make this right, Frank. Give me 24 hours." The phone calls spread like ripples in a pond, each veteran reaching out to two more, each story shared with the kind of precision that comes from military training. Within 6 hours, the network had reached across 37 states. Within 12 hours, men and women who hadn't spoken in decades were coordinating like they were planning a mission in hostile territory. Some of these veterans were millionaires now. Some were struggling to make ends meet. Some had become teachers. Others had built empires. Some carried visible scars from their service. Others bore wounds that only showed in their dreams. But every single one of them remembered what it meant to serve alongside Frank Martinez. They remembered his courage under fire, his willingness to share his rations when supplies ran low, his steady voice in the chaos of combat. What happened next would be talked about for decades. Because when you dishonor one veteran, you dishonor them all. And this brotherhood doesn't forget. Marcus Williams made the first reservation at exactly 9 a.m. the next morning. "I'd like to book the presidential suite for this weekend," he told the same receptionist who'd processed Frank's original reservation. "Dr. Marcus Williams, American Express Black Card." The reservation went through without question. 30 minutes later, Tommy Rodriguez called. "Tommy Rodriguez, Rodriguez Construction. I need your finest suite for my wife and myself. 3 nights, starting Thursday." Then came the calls that made the hotel's reservation system sing like a cash register in paradise. James Mitchell, the pharmaceutical executive who'd been Frank's radio operator, booked 2 adjoining luxury suites. Patricia Hayes, who'd served as a Navy nurse and now owned a chain of medical facilities, reserved the penthouse. Robert Chen, no relation to Bradley but carrying the weight of service in the Korean War, booked 4 rooms for his extended family reunion. By noon, every single room in the Grand Continental Hotel was reserved. 347 rooms, suites that cost more per night than Frank's monthly Social Security check, standard rooms that still commanded premium prices. Even the hotel's conference facilities had been booked for what the reservation system showed as private veteran appreciation events. The reservations came from every corner of America. Retired generals and former enlisted men, Navy admirals and Marine corporals, Air Force pilots and Army mechanics, women who'd broken barriers in military service and men who'd carried those barriers on their backs through hostile territory. The greatest generation and Vietnam veterans and Gulf War heroes and warriors from Afghanistan and Iraq. Bradley Chen noticed the unusual booking pattern around 2 p.m. when his manager called him into the office. "We've had the most incredible day," his supervisor beamed. "Every room booked solid for this weekend. High-end clientele. This could be our best quarterly numbers ever." Bradley smiled, thinking about his commission. He had no idea that his career was about to collide with the consequences of his own arrogance. The veterans' coordination was a masterpiece of military precision. Each phone call included specific instructions. "Arrive between 3 and 5 p.m. on Friday. Dress in your finest clothes, the kind that speak of success and demand respect. Bring your military identification, your discharge papers, any medals or commendations you might have. And most importantly, bring the story of what happened to Frank Martinez. Some veterans drove hundreds of miles. Others flew in from across the country. A few came by bus, pooling resources like they'd pooled ammunition in combat. They gathered not for revenge, but for justice. Not for destruction, but for education. Not for humiliation, but for the restoration of dignity that should never have been taken away." Friday afternoon arrived with the kind of crisp autumn weather that makes you grateful to be alive and free. The first veteran to enter the Grand Continental was Colonel Sarah Mitchell, retired Air Force. She wore a tailored business suit that cost more than most people's monthly salary. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, her bearing unmistakably military, despite her civilian clothes. She approached the reception desk where Bradley Chen was working the afternoon shift. "Colonel Sarah Mitchell checking in," she announced with the kind of authority that comes from commanding fighter squadrons. Bradley's fingers flew over the keyboard, his professional smile bright and welcoming. "Of course, Colonel Mitchell. We have you in the Ambassador Suite. Thank you for choosing the Grand Continental." 10 minutes later, Dr. Marcus Williams entered, dressed in a three-piece suit that spoke of medical success and personal achievement. His dark skin bore the dignified bearing of a man who'd saved lives in combat and continued saving them in civilian practice. "Dr. Williams, checking in." "Absolutely, Dr. Williams. Welcome to the Grand Continental." Then came Tommy Rodriguez in his finest Western wear, the kind that successful businessmen wear to charity galas. His company had built half the shopping centers in Phoenix, and his presence commanded respect in any room. By 4:30, the lobby was beginning to fill with the most distinguished group of guests the Grand Continental had ever hosted. CEOs and doctors, teachers and business owners, men and women whose success in civilian life was matched only by their service to their country. They moved with the quiet confidence of people who'd faced real challenges and emerged victorious. Bradley began to notice something unusual about this particular group of guests. There was a familiarity between them that went beyond normal hotel interactions. Conversations that started with phrases like, "Remember when we were in," and "How's your family doing since you got back from?" The manager's face went white when he realized who he had really thrown out. Because at exactly 5 p.m., the lobby doors opened one final time and Frank Martinez walked in. But this wasn't the same Frank Martinez who'd been humiliated and dismissed 3 days earlier. This Frank wore a pressed military dress uniform that fit him like a second skin despite the passage of decades. His chest displayed a rainbow of ribbons that told the story of heroism in America's longest war. The Purple Heart caught the lobby's chandelier light. The Bronze Star gleamed like a beacon of honor. The Vietnam Service Medal hung with the weight of sacrifice that had shaped a generation. Behind Frank came a procession that would have made Arlington Cemetery proud. Veterans in their finest clothes, their own medals polished to mirror brightness, their bearing straight and proud despite the arthritis and old wounds that marked their bodies like battle scars on the soul of America itself. The lobby fell silent. Not the uncomfortable silence of judgment, but the reverent silence of recognition. Other hotel guests, civilians who'd never worn the uniform, but understood honor when they saw it, stopped their conversations and watched as America's heroes filled the space where one of their own had been dismissed like a vagrant. Bradley Chen stood behind his mahogany desk, his face pale as winter snow, his hands trembling as he finally understood the magnitude of his mistake. This wasn't just about one old man in worn clothes. This was about every veteran who'd ever been overlooked, dismissed, or forgotten by a society that enjoyed freedom without acknowledging its price. Colonel Mitchell approached the desk with military precision. "I believe you owe this man an apology," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd commanded respect in environments where weakness meant death. Dr. Williams stepped forward, his medical credentials giving weight to his words. Frank Martinez served 2 tours in Vietnam. He saved lives under fire and carried wounded soldiers to safety when most people would have sought cover. Tommy Rodriguez moved to Frank's other side. This man served his country with honor when it was dangerous to do so. He came home to a country that spit on veterans, and he still carried himself with dignity. One by one, the veterans in that lobby began to speak, not shouting, not demanding, but sharing the quiet testimony of men and women who'd seen Frank Martinez at his finest. Under fire, under pressure, under the kind of circumstances that reveal a person's true character. The stories filled the air like incense in a chapel. Frank sharing his rations with a wounded soldier. Frank volunteering for dangerous patrols when others held back. Frank carrying an injured Marine to safety through enemy fire, taking shrapnel in his own leg but never stopping until his brother was safe. Bradley Chen listened to each story, his professional composure cracking like ice under pressure. The man he'd dismissed as unworthy was being described as a hero by people whose own accomplishments spoke of success and integrity. The worn jacket he'd judged so harshly had covered a chest full of medals. The humble bearing he'd mistaken for inadequacy was actually the quiet confidence of a man who'd proven himself when it mattered most. The hotel manager appeared from the back office, drawn by the unusual gathering in his lobby. He took one look at the distinguished crowd, at the medals and uniforms, at the unmistakable bearing of military service, and his business instincts immediately grasped what his employee had failed to understand. "Mr. Martinez," the manager said, approaching Frank with the kind of respect that should have been offered from the beginning. "On behalf of the Grand Continental Hotel, I offer you our most sincere apologies. Your service to this country and the disrespect you experienced here demands immediate action." He turned to Bradley Chen with the expression of a man who'd just realized his employee had insulted every guest in the hotel. "Bradley, you're terminated, effective immediately. Please clear out your desk and leave the premises." But Frank Martinez, the man who'd been humiliated and dismissed, raised his hand with the same authority he'd once used to signal his squad in the jungle. "Wait," he said quietly. The lobby fell silent again, waiting for words from the man at the center of this storm. "This young man made a mistake," Frank said, his voice carrying the wisdom of age and the perspective of someone who'd seen real enemies and real evil. "But I didn't serve my country to see people lose their jobs over ignorance that can be corrected with education." He looked directly at Bradley Chen, who stood trembling behind the desk like a soldier facing court-martial. "Son, do you understand what you did wrong?" Bradley's voice was barely a whisper. "I judged you by your appearance instead of your character. I failed to show respect to someone who earned it through service to our country." Frank nodded slowly. "And what have you learned? That honor doesn't depend on expensive clothes. That respect should be given based on a person's actions, not their bank account. That veterans like you deserve better from all of us." Frank turned to the hotel manager. "Give him another chance, but make sure he understands that every guest deserves respect, whether they're wearing a $1,000 suit or clothes from the thrift store. Some of the finest people I've ever known couldn't afford to stay in a place like this, but they earned the right to be treated with dignity." The manager looked around the lobby, taking in the faces of veterans who'd traveled hundreds of miles to support one of their own. He saw the lesson that was bigger than business, deeper than profit margins, more important than quarterly reports. "Mr. Chen," he said to Bradley, "you'll keep your job, but you'll also be attending sensitivity training, and you'll personally ensure that Mr. Martinez's stay here is everything it should have been from the beginning." Frank looked around the lobby at the faces of men and women who'd answered his call, who'd come from across the country to stand with him in this moment. These were his brothers and sisters in arms, his family forged in the fire of service to something greater than themselves. "You can all go home now," he said with a smile that carried the warmth of gratitude and the strength of unbreakable bonds. Mission accomplished. But they didn't leave. Not immediately. Instead, they gathered in the hotel's restaurant and bar, sharing stories and memories, reconnecting across decades of separation. They talked about Frank's courage, about their own service, about the importance of never forgetting the price of freedom. The weekend became an impromptu reunion, a celebration of service that filled the Grand Continental with laughter and camaraderie. Other hotel guests found themselves drawn into conversations with these veterans, learning stories they'd never heard, gaining perspective they'd never had. Bradley Chen worked every shift that weekend, not because he was required to, but because he wanted to learn. He listened to the stories, served these heroes with the respect they'd always deserved, and began to understand that true value has nothing to do with the price of your clothes or the balance in your bank account. The story of what happened at the Grand Continental spread beyond that weekend, beyond that hotel, beyond that city. It became a reminder that veterans never stop serving, never stop looking out for each other, never stop standing up for what's right. Frank Martinez returned to his small apartment, but he was no longer the same man who'd been turned away in the rain. He'd been reminded that his service mattered, that his sacrifice was remembered, that the brotherhood forged in combat never really ends. The worn leather jacket still hung in his closet, bearing the same small holes and weathered appearance. But now it was accompanied by letters from across the country, from veterans and civilians who'd heard his story and wanted him to know that they understood the value of his service. The hotel industry took notice too. Training programs were developed to educate staff about treating veterans with appropriate respect. Policies were changed to ensure that appearance-based discrimination became a thing of the past. But perhaps the most important change was in the hearts and minds of people who heard Frank's story. They learned that heroes don't always look like heroes. that service comes in many forms, that dignity and respect are rights that should never be denied based on the clothes someone wears or the size of their bank account. Years later, when people told the story of the veteran who got kicked out of a hotel only to have his old unit book every room in protest, they always ended with the same observation. Frank Martinez could have chosen revenge. He could have used his brother's loyalty to destroy Bradley Chen's career and humiliate the hotel. Instead, he chose grace. He chose education over retribution. He chose to build bridges instead of burning them down. That choice, more than any medal or commendation, revealed the true measure of the man. A warrior who'd learned that the greatest victories come not from defeating enemies, but from turning them into allies. A veteran who understood that real strength shows itself through mercy, not vengeance. The rain had stopped falling by the time Frank checked out of the Grand Continental 3 days later. Bradley Chen personally handled his departure, thanking him not just for his patience and forgiveness, but for the lesson in humanity that would shape the rest of his life. As Frank walked through those brass doors for the final time, he carried with him the knowledge that service never really ends. Whether you're carrying a wounded soldier to safety in the jungles of Vietnam, or teaching a young man about respect in the lobby of an upscale hotel, the mission remains the same. Stand up for what's right. Look out for your brothers and sisters. Remember that everyone deserves dignity, regardless of their circumstances. If Frank's story moved you to think differently about the veterans in your own community, drop a comment below and share how you'll honor their service in your daily life, because respect is something we all have the power to give.